The Rebuttal, a ProTactile poem by John Lee Clark. Performed to Yalitza Nuccio and Heather Holmes. Voiced by Halleen Anderson. This poem is called The Rebuttal. Guide. Passion. Catch what hath no speech. Unknown joys. Power. And meditations. Unfolding sky. Feeling draws heart and wildering language, still without speech to mind. Philosophy fails to sway this future child.
I struggled in writing poetry for many years, wasn't satisfied with what I was generating. I knew that there's a strong visual, or maybe vidus even, and hearing canon that could sort of infiltrate my language, and that those narratives, I wanted it to be my own. I wanted the poetry to be my own, and to also create a canon from the place that I was creating poetry from, as opposed to having this sort of ubiquitous canon foisted upon me. Because there were those oppressive forces, that I was trying to get away from. And in so doing, and that was really challenging. It was tough to find sort of my own way, because the community that I come from doesn't have a robust canon. And so there wasn't anything to generate, forces in that direction, like behind me to kind of propel me along. And so with some of the dominant, I guess I'll call it the dominant canon that I felt I did have access to was really constraining. So I did a lot of experimenting with different forms. I played with them quite a bit, played with the language, and tried to further things along. One way that I did that was through erasure poems. So I took some old poems that had archaic language, that had really some offensive language, and I got rid of some parts and used it to construct a different tale, to tell a different story, one that I wanted to tell coming from the place that I was coming from. And that yielded some really cool effects and cool results. So I was really satisfied with that. I was able to kind of hack my way in using that approach. So erasure was one way. And I had a nice erasure poem, and collection of erasures. But when I would distribute those among other members of the deaf community in English, that was a struggle, because what I want to do is create a deaf-blind poetry, and further that in the community. And so that forced me to come up with a new ProTactile poem from ProTactile language, which deviated from that written English poem. It was a great process. There were seeds from the English poem, but it became its own thing. But now if I couldn't touch a deafblind person to kind of generate that second version of the poem, then what I was doing was thinking about how I might do that virtually, how I might share that poem with them through PT in a virtual way. And so I did that through the description, which was that third version of the poem, the rebuttal. The second version being the ProTactile version, the direct contact ProTactile version. The third version was from a first person perspective. It was really from what I experienced subjectively as a person, or the poet, but person reading that poem and sharing that with two other people in a ProTactile three-way. And again, that version also wasn't the same as the original written English version, which is okay. That's not the goal, you know. Sometimes it'll contain some of the elements of the original narrative. And again, those will be sort of like seeds. But I used it really to sort of further a process. And that process then yielded byproducts. And those three different versions were the byproducts of my creative process as I happened on new things and new discoveries in the process of creating the poems. So my goal really in all three wasn't to have them align with one another. My goal was to generate more creative processes, you know, one kind of leading, tending like little seeds to the next. And so what I wanted to do was to reject, again, that dominant canon. And that was really the whole nature and point of Rebuttal, was rejecting some of those dominant narratives, you know, that were in the lives of deafblind people throughout the ages, then as well as now, you know, in the canon, in the poetic canon. Well, one thing that might be good for you to be aware of is that the level of access that I have to contemporary poetry is minimal. It's difficult to access. I use Bookshare, and Bookshare is good for prose. There's quite a bit on there. But when it comes to poetry, it's lacking because a lot of the things that poetry kind of yields, you know, the line breaks, the spacing, all of those details can be sometimes changed, omitted, and so the effect can be diminished. And so what I did was to delve into more traditional poetry, like Project Gutenberg. And that was a really neat opportunity for me to just really, jump in, dive in, and access the poems that were in the public domain. And that was a pleasure for me to read all of those old poems, you know, the verse poems, and those got me thinking in reading those, just what I came upon and the terrain of those. It brought up ideas for me about how I could, again, discover some elements in there that I could work with, get in, shift around, and find a place. And so rearranging some of those, and the erasure project I started before I actually knew the term erasure. I didn't know that that was a form of poetry. The idea, in fact, that you find when you use the English word erasure doesn't align completely with, I think, exactly what I was doing. Because erasure poems will actually leave spaces, oftentimes, where you have sort of redacted the original. And so you end up with these really large white spaces, you know, lacunae, sort of, if you will. And I had no idea about that aspect, you know, of the erasure form. So I kind of created my own erasures. I sort of, because I didn't know what an erasure was, so I just naturally kind of happened upon this process that was really generative for me. And then come to find out, realized, oh, this is a thing that many poets do. Okay. And then when I explored further what their ideas were when they worked in that form, I realized that the forms don't align. exactly. I don't think, or the processes. But again, I didn't really learn that that was its own sort of genre until later. And as I constructed these novel erasure poems, novel to me, at the same time, ProTactile poetry was developing. And I was thinking about, because ProTactile poetry is altogether new, which means that we have to figure out a form, what kinds of content is typically contained, within ProTactile poetry. All of these thoughts are just kind of churning around in my mind. And so I had these organic forms that I was generating, and those actually helped spark development then in the ProTactile poetry realm. And so the erasure wasn't just finished as it was, it led to, it was good, but then it led to a development of like the other versions, and not just, as products for sure, but in furthering the process as well. So the hearing side of canon, again, is so dominant, and it contains so much. A lot of poetries are in the underground, kind of beneath it, And so the question is, how can we break ground, and come up from underneath it in novel ways? And erasures, I think, are one way to crack the ground of that traditional canon, the contemporary canon, and get our put our blades to the sky, so to speak. And so there's lots of different ways to do that. And what we want is to have as many kind of cracks in the ground as possible so that we can make our way up through in as many ways as possible, really flexibly and dynamically. We don't want one kind of rote way. We want something that's going to really cause the ground to crumble when all of the things grow up through it, right? Not just a single tree coming up in its spot, but we want something that is going to just really kind of tear up the street, tear up the sidewalk. So those three pieces that you're referring to of the rebuttal, those are really byproducts of a much larger, more complicated process of creation. Indeed, yes. I might go in one direction, and I might happen upon something, and it might send me off in some other directions, other vectors. It's not a linear process, and it's not linear in either direction. It's not like one necessarily leads to the other. It's really more of like a splintering, a shifting. It's not a simple forward progression or a linear, like kind of assembly line type thing. It's really much more, I think, organic and shifting and slippery than that. Sometimes I think the hearing sided canon that comes down to us in all of its, with all of its heft, that heft doesn't mean that it doesn't benefit at all. We can take from that, we could steal a little bit. And yes, there's abuses and traumas, that come along with it, but it doesn't mean that we receive no balm or no benefit whatsoever, or no, I guess maybe catharsis through that. There are things that we can take from it and move forward. So it's not a wholesale rejection. And I oftentimes, when I write in English, deaf people, many deafblind people experience language deprivation, did not have a strong first language. And so because of that, have had limited acquisition of English as a second language. I fortunately did have a strong foundation in a first language. And so I am able to think critically about the relationship I have with written English. And I think that's why I'm able to not just generate something in English and call that the end product and move on, but use that as the impetus for forces that then propel me in other directions, into other realms. because it's definitely not as simple as creating an English poem and then having that be the end of the process.